After 2 wonderful months in the Sandblast Islands, and almost a month on the peaceful Chagres River, we have finally arrived in the Atlantic entrance to the Panama Canal. Our arrival at the Panama Canal marks a serious milestone in our journey, and one that I have been thinking about since day one, as, very soon, Tarka's hull will be wetted by an ocean she has not touched in almost 30 years. But more on that later. Here on the Caribbean side, we have anchored in the designated anchorage for small boats behind the immense breakwater. The majority of this space is designated for large shipping vessels, but there is a small area marked for us by a yellow buoy, and also by a number of derelict vessels long since abandoned. This is the staging area for small boats waiting to transit the Panama Canal. And fortunately for us, the anchorage sits outside of the entrance to Shelter Bay Marina, the only marina here on the Atlantic entrance. The marina itself is adjacent to an old US military base, and some of those buildings and runway have since been repurposed by the Panamanian Navy following the transition from US control back in 1999. Our neighbors are a mixed bunch. Most of them will be transiting the canal, and the ones that are leaving soon stand out easily with their fenders hung over and ready to go. Others are absolutely huge and make even the biggest of cruising sailboats look pretty small. But our favorite neighbors are of course our friends on Perception, who are anchored close to us, and perhaps too close.
I'll pants myself in front of Brian while he's filming.
I can't zoom in enough to see that tiny part. There's a lot of commotion in the anchorage with advisors being dropped off for transits or measurements. And we too soon will be doing all of that good stuff. But for now, we thought it'd be fun to go explore the area and get a feel for the place.
She thinks she sells dolphins.
I'm 100% sure she sells dolphins.
Nisha's 50% sure she sells dolphins. It's so cool. Oh, it's coming right towards me. You caught him. What kind of fish was that? Look at the doggy. Aha, it's a jack, yeah. Yeah, grande. Hey.
The area around the marina is mostly dense rainforest, with all the things that come with such a rich environment. This includes our friend, the three-toed sloth, probably the spirit animal of our generation. Spotting sloths is actually pretty tricky. If they're moving at all, it's usually so slowly that they go unnoticed. But by the same hand, they spend most of their time in just one or two trees. So if someone else has spotted a sloth somewhere, you have a pretty good chance of seeing one in the same spot. Some of the other jungle wildlife makes its presence known much more easily. This large group of capuchin monkeys created a stir in the trees above us as they leaped from branch to branch. Panamanian capuchin monkeys are an interesting bunch. Females born into the social group will remain with the group for life, but the males will eventually migrate from group to group. However, a male usually stays with a single group for 4 to 5 years, but sometimes up to 17 years. That means that occasionally male capuchin monkeys will father not only their daughter's children, but also their granddaughter's children.
It looks like a young one.
Yeah, it's the one I'm filming. There are also remnants of fortifications built to protect the Panama Canal during World War II. Large artillery guns once sat here and would send steel rain down upon imposing naval foes. But those have long since been removed, and all that remains are the decaying remnants, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. We wrapped up our day of trekking with a visit to the Caribbean for probably the last time. We can't do any snorkeling here, but it was good to see the ocean that has been our home for 2 years now, and perhaps thank it for keeping us safe. There is always something that needs fixing on a boat, and Murphy's Law demands that it will always be in the most inconvenient location. But luckily there are 2 of us, and teamwork makes the dream work.
With your foot, okay.
Other issues are pretty minor, like our outboard pole cord breaking and needing to be replaced.
It's working.
Now I can enjoy my coffee.
Finally. Oh no.
But we also need to make sure Tarka is in tip-top shape for her canal transit. We'll be required to make 5 or 6 knots, and we'll be heavy with 7 people on the boat. Any delay that is our fault runs at a penalty of $400 an hour, and so it's important that the engine is behaving well. And actually, the engine overheated briefly as we motored over here from the river the other day. And after a bit of debugging, I eventually narrowed it down to a fouled-up heat exchanger.
So I had to pull our heat exchanger out because the engine overheated on our way over from the river. I pulled it to clean it, and now it's pretty clean. You can see here our engine's cooled by fresh water, which cuts down on corrosion, but ultimately the heat gets rejected into the salt water. So there's 2 water loops. There's the raw water, the salt water, and there's fresh water. And the fresh water is actually what circulates around the cylinders internal to the engine. On the engine, the assembly looks like this, and then in between there's the header tank, the cooling water. On this outside portion of the tube stack, you have fresh water or coolant, and that can actually flow between all the pipes in here. And then going through the pipes, we have the salt water, which then transfers energy from the fresh water to the salt water, and it gets spewed out the back of the boat. So salt water comes in here and then exits here, but because there's a divider The incoming water that comes through the bottom here must go through the heat exchanger before it can go back out. It goes through the bottom set of tubes all the way to the other side, and on the other side there's just a single cap, a rounded cap, and so that goes over the back like this. And so all the water that comes through the bottom here, the only place it has to go is back to the top set of pipes. So if this gets clogged, then we're not exchanging heat very well, and the coolant will start to boil away. So now I'm going to go ahead and put this back in the boat, and that should solve all our overheating issues. So now the heat exchanger is clean. Let's talk a little bit about why it needed to be cleaned at all. We have these sacrificial zincs that are within the heat exchanger itself, immersed in the seawater, the raw water. And the purpose of the zinc, of course, is to protect the engine, as there are other metals in the engine block. Those metals can start to corrode, basically act like a battery. And so what you can do, and what is often done, and what should be done on most engines, is you put a pencil zinc like this, and so you've basically created a more favorable metal to oxidize. It's going to sacrifice itself instead of the less noble metals that are in the engine. But the other issue with the zincs, at least in our engine, as that zinc starts to corrode, it creates zinc oxide, which is like this white powdery substance, and so that zinc oxide basically gets deposited into the tubes of the heat exchanger as well as on the face of the heat exchanger, and it ends up clogging the flow, and eventually the heat exchanger stops doing its job. So by protecting our engine of the zinc, we also create a problem, but there's not much we can do about that right now. The only thing we really can do is just be more careful about checking our zincs more frequently, and that way we would much rather replace a zinc every month, if that's what it comes down to, than have to extract the heat exchanger and clean it, because that's kind of a messy, big job, and it also requires us to replace the O-rings, which we don't have a lot of.
After putting the heat exchanger back together, I jumped in for a quick inspection of the hull, as well as the prop to take care of any fouling. Every little thing we can do to reduce the amount of work the engine has to do will be helpful. Another requirement for our Transit is that we must have a shaded cockpit, which we of course don't. We came up with an improvised solution which, with the weather, quickly highlighted some of the flaws with the design. This isn't the way we usually collect rainwater, but we're also not going to waste it. Every bit is helpful. The next morning, while Nushta was running errands on shore, I spotted a dog on the reef, which was pretty unusual. There are no nearby towns, and the dog had clearly been swimming, and it didn't really look like a stray. Eventually, I decided that he probably slipped off one of the anchored boats and ended up here. Unfortunately, though, I couldn't get him to come to the dinghy, and went back to Tarka to try to see if I can find the owners on the VHF. But by the time I got back to Tarka, I realized the dog had jumped back into the water and was trying to swim back to his boat. But the wind was pretty strong, and the dog had no idea which boat was his, and even if he did, he wasn't going to be able to climb back up on his own. Basically, he was probably going to drown out here. So it was time to launch a rescue. I was also alone, and the camera was not my priority, so I apologize for all the shaky footage. But getting him into the dinghy wasn't going to be easy, as he had no desire to join me. Since I quickly realized I wasn't going to be able to manage on my own, I went over to a nearby boat and recruited some assistance. In the end, though, I was able to manhandle him over my shoulder and into the dinghy. I had a suspicion that he came off a catamaran that was anchored nearby, as there was a similar dog on board, but no one was home, and if I was wrong, it sure would be awkward to come back to some random dog on your boat. So instead I went to the marina, where surely their owners would be around somewhere.
I got a dog.
Where did you get this from?
No, I think it fell off a boat on the anchorage. I don't know for sure.
Really? What, you found it swimming? You found it in the water?
So first he was on the reef out there by the shipwreck. And he was sitting out for hours, so I went over him to see like what his deal was. The strays don't just sit on the reef.
Oh, these are new friends of ours, and we'll talk more about them later.
Yeah.
Looking out of the water. He was limping on the reef, so I don't know if he like cut himself when he was
No.
coming in.
Oh, well done.
Is that yummy? Yeah?
Eventually, we tracked down the dog's owners, and he was reunited with his family. It turns out that he actually caught a large 3-prong hook on his way off the boat that had completely penetrated and broke off inside of his paw. He's fine, but he would later need to have some minor surgery to extract the hook. I'm just happy that this story had a happy ending, and the owners became new friends of ours. Before we transit the canal on Tarka, we've decided to volunteer as line handlers for another boat. Every boat needs 4 line handlers in addition to the captain, so there's always people looking for help. It's also a great experience for us to know what to expect when we go through ourselves. We're very excited as this will be our first time through the Panama Canal, which is a huge bucket list item for us. But more on that next time.
Oh, you should be happy. It's already happy. I don't want to. Better?
Yeah, let's go. I wish I had the camera for that.